Great. All right, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 1. This is going to be our introduction to labor economics. This should be a simple chapter that's just kind of going over the basics and provide a roadmap for what we're going to do for the rest of the course. We're going to go through an example of working with supply and demand for the labor market. Don't be concerned if you don't 100% understand everything we're doing. This is sort of just foreshadowing what we're going to talk about. We will break down each topic that we talk about, so the supply curve, the demand curve, and later talk about the government in more detail in their own chapter later. So that's not something I want you to worry about at this point. It's mostly just giving you a taste and showing you how we work with models. So the textbook, this chapter begins with a quote that observation always involves theory. Quite a few people have said this. Friedrich Hayek also said that theory is necessary to understand data. And we'll read a little bit more of Hayek later on in this first week. So in this course, we're less concerned about data because this is designed for people going into human resources or continuing in human resources rather than purely empirical economists. So we'll be focusing on theory, less with data, but we need to have a solid background of knowledge of economic concepts, economic theory, so that we can apply them to real world situations, and you can do that throughout your career. So I hope to design this course with as much practical work as possible. However, since it's still an economics course, you're still going to get a healthy dose of theory. But don't worry, I will try to make this as painless as possible. So why are you here in this class? Obviously, because it's required. But it's required because labor economics can provide a useful set of tools for you in your career in human resources. So we're going to be looking at how labor markets work, how workers make decisions about where to work, how much they want to work, and how firms decide to employ workers. How many do they want to employ? What kind of wages do they want to pay them? So the goal for this course is for you to walk away with an understanding of how labor markets function on both sides. So that as a human resources representative, you can understand the decisions facing the firm, and you can understand the decisions facing the worker. We're going to begin with the decision to work, to hire or fire workers, and whether the worker wants to find a job or leave for another job. So we'll be concerned, again, right away with both sides of the labor market. From there, we'll move on to see how wages are determined in a market context. We'll then look at different payment structures, how education affects workers, not just their wages, but also their skills, and even touch on income inequality. When you think of economics as a field, what do you think of, besides something to help you fall asleep at night? In general, economics is the study of human decision-making. We typically think of it as having to do with businesses or even with stocks. One of the most common questions I get when I tell people that I'm an economist is what's going to happen in the stock market. But it's much more broad than that. The great economist Ludwig von Mises titled his magnum opus Human Action to reflect the depth that's contained within the field and the building blocks from which we start. Economics is typically focused on human action within a market context. So we're talking about buying and selling. And when most people think of economics, really that's what they think of, is buying and selling in the marketplace. Now we're going to be focusing on one specific type of market, and that's the labor market. Now it's one small but important component of the field of economics. My area of expertise is within labor economics, so I would argue that it's the most important, but I might be just a little bit biased in that assessment. But what's interesting, or hopefully interesting for you, is that we'll be focusing on both sides of the labor market. Because in your job, you will be representing firms, but also dealing with employees, representing them in some cases, or at the very least, it will be helpful to understand where they're coming from and what their needs are while you're fulfilling your role for the firm. So you can think of this course as a description of how labor markets work. We start with two main players. We start with workers and firms. Then we'll add the government. They regulate the labor market. And then from there, we expand our analysis to different areas within the labor market. So different payment structures, human capital unions, things like that. But let's start with the workers. Workers look for what we call the best job. But what is the best? You might be shocked to hear this from an economist, but not everything is money. It's not just the job that pays the most. So it's things like a combination of the effort that you have to put in when you're on the job, both physical and mental, the type of role within the company, how long the commute is that you face, the flexibility in working hours, and the ability to take time off, and even control over yourself, whether you want to own your own business or work for someone else. There's a lot more. We could spend all day listing the different things that people look for in a job. In general, especially when we're working with these models of the labor market, we can simplify this and say that workers want to sell their labor for the highest price, in this case, the highest wages. But there are cases where we may be looking at other things that workers want to maximize. On the other hand, we have firms. In general, firms want to maximize their profit. Part of the path to maximize your profits is to minimizing your costs. That's half the equation. And these costs include labor costs. So firms want to hire workers for the lowest possible wages. And once we put together a model of the full labor market, considering both workers and firms, we'll see how this bargaining back and forth is what ends up setting the market wages. Now, of course, government gets involved, and they typically do so through regulations, which change how workers and firms relate to one another. The goal is to make things better, the labor market function more efficiently, or to protect consumers, or to protect workers. It may not always be true in practice. As we'll talk about later, there's costs and benefits to every sort of regulation, every law or government action. So we have to consider both sides of the equation, the good and the bad. Now, it's worth noting, I said that firms look to maximize profits. That's the general case. In some cases, in the short term, firms want to do things like maximize revenue or maximize sales, but typically their long-term goal is to maximize profits. So we just simplify it and say firms look for profits. Now, to begin with the three actors, first, we'll talk about workers. This is the most important actor because without workers, there's no labor, there's no firms. They can't exist without having the people to actually do the job. So workers want to maximize their well-being, and we take this broadly, not just maximize their income. What we typically say as economists is maximize benefits subject to constraints. So there are all these negative things out there, there are all these costs. We want to maximize the benefits compared to those costs. And again, take a broad conception of benefits when we're broadly talking about workers. Now, workers are willing to supply more time and more effort to those activities that have a higher payoff. So, if you make more money, you're more willing to do those things. So we end up with an upward sloping supply curve. If you pay me more, I'll be more willing to work with you. There's a lot of jobs out there that we would not be willing to take at the wages that are being offered. But if firms increase how much they're willing to pay you, you'd be much more likely to take the job. The example I used to give in my Econ 102 class is that I wouldn't want to flip burgers at Burger King at the current wages, but if they offer me $200,000, $300,000 a year, I don't know how anyone could pass that up. Next actor is firms. So firms decide who they want to hire, who they want to fire, and how much they want to pay them, how they want them to work together in teams. Firms are motivated basically to maximize profits, to be as profitable as possible. They have what we call a hard budget constraint, where they cannot make less in revenues than how much they spend, what their costs are over the long term. Because of that, they have to try to minimize the costs and maximize their revenues. Now, the relationship between the price of labor and how many workers that the firms are willing to hire can basically be described by a downward sloping demand curve. If the wages that they're paying are lower, firms are able to hire more workers. So think of an example from sports. An NBA team can afford either a couple stars at a very high salary, or they can afford a lot of decent role players at a much lower salary. Okay, but firms and workers are not the end of the story. There's a third actor, a third player in this story, and that's the government. So the supply curve, sorry about that. The supply curve and the demand curve are the most important part of the story, but not the entire story. So government plays an important role through regulations in the labor market. For instance, I study occupational licensing laws. These laws set minimum standards for professionals like teachers, doctors, nurses, things like that, and they create a board to regulate these professionals as they practice. The laws set minimum standards, basically setting education And exams are two of the biggest ones, but there are a whole bunch of other smaller things. And the education and exams are designed to improve the quality as much as possible and ensure that anyone practicing is good enough that they're not going to harm consumers. But these laws also distort labor markets. So, for instance, those licensing requirements like education exams, which can improve quality, also keep people out of a profession. There's now fewer professionals practicing once you implement a licensing law. So that's going to change how labor markets function. It makes it harder for people just starting out to get the education to enter the market. It also makes it more difficult for people working in one profession to change to another if there's a relative shortage, and it will be better off for consumers if more people enter the field. So it is going to change how labor markets function, and that's why any study of labor markets in general should include some work on the government, and we will have a few chapters on that later. There are other regulations like the Occupational Safety Hazard Administration, OSHA, which seek to protect workers from injury. But at the same time, it can also annoy workers. So it changes how they work, maybe how many people are on the job or how long it takes to complete the job. I used to work in a furniture factory during my summer breaks in undergrad, and I can tell you from experience, some of these regulations do a good job of keeping workers safe, but they can also be annoying for the workers and add on some of the work because it's harder to do things safely than it can be to cut corners. So the idea that government is important in labor markets goes back to Adam Smith. So we're talking way back in 1776. The way he kind of conceptualized it and the way we explain it today is that the government sets the rules of the game for transactions in the marketplace. While in a free market, they're not directly involved buying or selling, they set the rules and they sort of settle disputes between parties. And this is true whether it's goods or labor. So for example, in the United States today, you cannot sell yourself into slavery, you cannot sell your work for $2 an hour, and you can't work if you're 10 years old. Now, very, very few people would say that these are unreasonable laws. I wouldn't say that they're unreasonable laws, but just because they're good doesn't mean they don't distort or alter the market in some way than what it would be like without these regulations or laws, which is why it's interesting and important to include these in our study and our analysis. All right, so let's briefly put together the labor market and look at supply and demand. Again, this isn't going to tell you everything you need to know. So don't worry if you don't get this 100%. This is sort of a look at where we're going to be going. And we'll end with a discussion on positive versus normative analysis. So it's important to see some positive analysis before we get to explaining what it is. Okay, so in this model of the labor market, we're only going to consider earnings or wages as benefits for workers. We're not going to think about the other things that we can't put a monetary value on. So workers want to maximize their well-being. So in this case, they're going to choose to work such that the wages they receive are more valuable than the costs associated with working. So when we add up the decisions of millions of workers, that creates our labor supply curve. We can say that this labor supply curve, there's a very similar one for each individual worker for if they're willing to work or how many hours they're willing to work. We then add them together and we can create this, this supply curve for the entire market. So in here, the x-axis is the employment, the number of workers that are willing to work, while the y-axis is the earnings that they're being paid or the wages that they're paid. Now, in this case, the labor supply curve, and in general, the labor supply curve slopes upwards because as firms offer more money, more people are willing to work. So in this example, if a firm offers wages of $30,000 per year, 10,000 people are going to be willing to work as engineers for that salary. But now let's say the firm raises their wages to 40,000 per year. The number of people willing to be an engineer increases to 20,000. Again, because now there's this higher wages, it can draw them from being unemployed. Maybe they were sitting at home because it wasn't worth it to get a job. Now it is at $40,000. Maybe someone is working in another profession and only making $30,000 and they say, hey, I'd like to be an engineer, especially because I can get a raise by doing it. It's going to draw people into the market. And if we increase wages even more, say to $50,000 a year, even more people will be willing to work. Now, firms face the opposite type of curve. They have a downward sloping demand curve. And the demand curve represents the relationship between how many workers that they are willing to employ at each price. As the cost of each employee or their wages that the firms have to pay increases, firms are willing and able to hire fewer workers. So if we look at $50,000 per year, if firms are offering that much, they're only able to hire 10,000 workers. If they only paid $40,000, so they dropped the salary that they were offering, they'd be willing to hire 20,000 workers at that price. And at $30,000 a year, they're willing to hire 30,000 workers. Now, what is great about supply and demand curves is that we can combine these two for our analysis like we do here. So at $50,000, let's say that's where firms set the wages. If we take that across and hit the labor demand curve, this tells us that firms would be willing to hire 10,000 engineers at that price. However, if we take that price, trace it all the way across the labor supply curve, we see 30,000 people would be willing to work as engineers. So firms can only afford so many employees because they have that hard budget constraint. But a lot of people would like to make that much money as an engineer. So if firms tried to offer this much money, there'd be a lot of engineers applying for open positions. And a lot of people sitting on the sidelines as unemployed because there aren't that many spots left. So you'd end up with 10,000 spots filled and then 20,000 people applying for these jobs, not able to get them. Now, Adam Smith first noted in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations that this situation would not be permanent. Eventually, we'll reach equilibrium where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. So to give you a preview of what we're going to do, and this is going to be in chapter 4, so a few weeks down the line, workers are going to start to be willing to take lower wages. As they're unemployed, they say, hey, I could have made $50,000 before, but I'll be happy to take 45 if it means I can get a job and work. So firms will start offering lower and lower wages because that's what workers will accept. And it'll trend downwards until we reach $40,000 for new hires. At that point, we won't have people unemployed or looking for jobs because they'll be either willing to be just completely unemployed and not be applying for jobs, or they'll be moving to other industries. Now, this is going to take some time to do and is not constant across all firms and employees. So there's a lot more complexity than just saying, soon everyone will make $40,000 because that's equilibrium. But this is the basic idea that we're going to explore more in depth later.